The teacup shattered on the marble floor before Alexander even realized his hand had gone weak. Every head in the drawing room turned toward the sound, but Alexander was not looking at the broken porcelain scattered near his boots. He was staring at the hand that had just poured his tea, and more precisely, at the small iron ring resting on the maid's finger. For a moment the entire room seemed to fade into silence. The chatter of his aunts, the clinking of silver spoons, the soft crackle of the fireplace, all of it disappeared. Alexander could only see that ring, its surface dull and scratched, a tiny heart etched crookedly into the metal as though carved by a child's unsteady hand. Because it had been carved by a child's unsteady hand, his hand. "Your Grace, I am so sorry," the young maid said quickly, dropping to her knees to gather the broken pieces. Her voice trembled, not from fear of punishment, but from the way the Duke was looking at her, as if he had seen a ghost standing in servant's clothing. "Leave it," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. The maid froze, unsure if she had heard him correctly. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Nora, hurried forward to smooth over the awkward moment. "Forgive her, Your Grace. She is new to the house. I will see that she is more careful in the future." "I said leave it," Alexander repeated, louder this time, drawing curious glances from his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, who sat stiffly on the settee with a teacup poised halfway to her lips. "Alexander," Margaret said, her tone carrying the quiet warning she had perfected over decades of managing a household and a son who had, in her opinion, always been far too curious about things that did not concern him. "The girl will clean it up. Sit down and finish your tea." But Alexander was no longer thinking about tea. He crouched down beside the young maid, ignoring the scandalized gasp from his Aunt Beatrice, and looked directly into the maid's face for the first time since she had entered the room that afternoon. She had auburn hair pulled back into a tight knot, a few loose strands framing a face that was pale with worry. Her eyes, a shade of green he had not seen in 20 years, widened as she realized how closely he was studying her. "Your ring," Alexander said quietly so only she could hear. "Where did you get it?" The maid's hands stilled over the broken porcelain. "It is nothing, Your Grace, just an old trinket." "It is not nothing," Alexander said. "I made that ring myself when I was 10 years old in the orchard behind the old gardener's cottage." The maid's face went white. She said nothing, but her hands began to tremble so violently that a shard of porcelain slipped from her fingers and clattered back onto the floor. "Alexander, what on earth are you doing?" his mother demanded, rising from the settee now, her patience thinning by the second. Alexander stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the maid's face. "What is your name?" "Eliza, Your Grace," the housekeeper answered on the maid's behalf, clearly eager to end the strange scene unfolding in front of the family. "Eliza Hart. She started with us only a fortnight ago." "Hart?" The name struck Alexander like a blow to the chest. He had not heard that surname spoken aloud in 2 decades, not since the day his father had ordered the gardener's family off the estate grounds without so much as a proper farewell. He remembered standing at his bedroom window, watching a cart loaded with meager belongings roll away down the long drive, and a small girl with auburn hair looking back at the manor one final time before the cart disappeared around the bend. He had cried that night, though he never told anyone why. His tutors had assumed he was upset about being sent away to boarding school the following week. No one ever knew that his heart had been broken by the departure of a gardener's daughter, a girl who had been his only true friend during the lonely years of his childhood. "Eliza Hart," Alexander repeated softly, testing the name on his tongue as though it might dissolve if he said it too firmly. "Daughter of Edmund Hart, the gardener." The room had gone completely silent now. Even Aunt Beatrice had stopped fanning herself. Every eye turned toward Eliza, who remained kneeling on the floor, porcelain shards forgotten in her lap, her green eyes locked with the Duke's as though the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. "Yes, Your Grace," Eliza finally managed to say, her voice barely audible. "Edmund Hart was my father." Margaret set down her teacup with a sharp clink against its saucer. "This is absurd." Alexander, you cannot possibly remember a gardener's family from 20 years ago. But Alexander did remember. He remembered everything. He remembered summer afternoons spent hiding from his tutors among the apple trees, teaching a gardener's daughter how to read using books smuggled from the manor library. He remembered the two of them lying in the tall grass, watching clouds drift overhead, inventing stories about faraway kingdoms where dukes married whoever they pleased and nobody cared about titles or bloodlines. And he remembered the last day before his family sent him away, when he had taken a scrap of iron wire from the stables and twisted it into two crude rings, giving one to Eliza and keeping the other for himself. He remembered pressing the ring into her small palm and making a promise that only a foolish, hopeful child could make. "One day I will marry you." He had kept his own ring for years afterward, hidden in a drawer in his old bedroom, until his mother found it during a spring cleaning and, believing it to be a worthless piece of junk, had it discarded along with other childhood clutter. Alexander had searched for it desperately when he discovered it missing, but by then it was long gone, buried somewhere in the estate's refuse. He had told himself over the years that the memory was simply a childish fantasy, something he had exaggerated in his mind until it felt more significant than it truly was. He had convinced himself that Eliza Hart, wherever she had gone, had likely forgotten him entirely, had grown up and married some village boy, and never once thought of the awkward duke's son who used to sneak apples from the orchard just to share them with her. But here she was, kneeling on the floor of his family's drawing room, wearing the very ring he had made for her with his own clumsy, 10-year-old hands. "Eliza," Alexander said again, and this time there was something almost pleading in his voice, something that made his mother's frown deepen with concern. "Do you remember the orchard?" Eliza's eyes glistened, but she quickly blinked back whatever emotion threatened to surface. She rose to her feet, gathering the broken porcelain into her apron, her posture stiff and formal once more, as though a wall had suddenly come down between them. "I remember many things from my childhood, Your Grace," she said carefully. "But I am here now only to serve this household properly. I hope my clumsiness today will not cost me my position." It was a deflection, and Alexander recognized it immediately. There was fear in her voice, fear of what might happen if she admitted too much in front of the Dowager Duchess and the assembled family. He understood in that moment that whatever history existed between them, Eliza was determined to bury it, to protect the fragile security of her employment, rather than risk everything on a memory that might mean nothing to the man standing before her now. "Nora, take the girl to the kitchen and see that she is calmed," Margaret said sharply, clearly eager to restore order to her drawing room. "Alexander, come sit down. You are making a spectacle of yourself in front of your aunt." Alexander reluctantly stepped back, allowing Nora to usher Eliza out of the room. But as Eliza passed by him, their eyes met one final time, and in that brief exchange, Alexander saw something that told him this was no coincidence, no simple trick of fate. Eliza remembered everything just as vividly as he did. She was simply too afraid or too proud to admit it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Alexander sat through the remainder of the tea gathering in near silence, offering only clipped responses to his aunt's attempts at conversation, his mind entirely consumed by thoughts of the girl who had just walked out of the room wearing a ring he had made for her 2 decades ago. When the guests finally departed and the house grew quiet, Margaret found her son standing alone in the study, staring out the window toward the old orchard, which had long since been replaced by a formal rose garden. "You must put this out of your mind," Margaret said, closing the study door behind her. "Whatever foolish notion has taken hold of you, Alexander, I insist you abandon it immediately. She is a servant in this house, nothing more." "She was my friend," Alexander said quietly, not turning from the window, "before you sent her family away." Margaret's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been guilt, though she quickly composed herself. "Your father made decisions regarding the estate staff. I had little say in the matter." "And what decision was that, exactly?" Alexander asked, finally turning to face his mother. Why were the hearts sent away so suddenly? I never received a proper explanation, even as a boy. There was an accident, Margaret said carefully. Edmund Hart was injured while working on the grounds. Your father felt it best that the family relocate afterward. These things happen on large estates, Alexander. It is unfortunate, but it is not something that concerns you now, all these years later. Alexander studied his mother's face, searching for the details she was clearly choosing not to share. He had learned over the years that his mother rarely spoke in half-truths without good reason. Something about the circumstances of the Hart family's departure was being carefully smoothed over, and he intended to discover exactly what that something was. I would like to speak with her again, Alexander said. Properly, not as Duke and Maid, but as two people with a shared history. Absolutely not, Margaret said firmly. You are betrothed, Alexander, in all but formal announcement, to Lady Cordelia Ashford. The match has been discussed with her father for months. You cannot risk scandal by fraternizing with a housemaid, regardless of whatever childhood fantasy you have constructed around her. I have made no formal agreement with Lady Cordelia, Alexander reminded her. You will, Margaret said, her voice leaving no room for argument. It is the sensible match, the necessary match. Whatever nostalgia you feel for a gardener's daughter must remain exactly that. Nostalgia, nothing more. Alexander said nothing further, allowing his mother to believe the conversation had ended in her favor. But as she left the study, closing the door softly behind her, he made a private decision that he had no intention of sharing with anyone in the household just yet. He would learn the truth about what happened to the Hart family all those years ago, and he would find a way to speak with Eliza again, properly this time, without the watchful eyes of servants and relatives hovering nearby. That evening, long after the household had settled into its nightly quiet, Alexander found himself standing at the edge of the rose garden where the orchard once stood. The moon hung low over the estate, casting silver light across the neatly trimmed hedges that had replaced the wild apple trees of his childhood. He tried to remember exactly where the old gardener's cottage had stood, but so much had changed over 20 years that he could no longer be certain. He thought about Eliza's face when she had first seen him staring at her ring, the mixture of recognition and terror that had crossed her features before she quickly masked it with practiced servility. He thought about the promise he had made her as a boy, a promise spoken with the reckless confidence of childhood, before either of them understood the weight of titles and social expectations. One day I will marry you. He had meant it then, with the whole innocent heart of a lonely 10-year-old boy who had found, in a gardener's daughter, the only genuine friendship he had ever known. And standing now in the moonlit garden, 20 years older and burdened with responsibilities he never asked for, Alexander realized with startling clarity that some part of him still meant it now. A sound from the direction of the servants' quarters drew his attention. He turned to see a figure moving quietly along the garden path, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill. Even in the dim moonlight, he recognized her immediately. Eliza had not seen him yet. She walked slowly, her head down, lost in her own thoughts, until she nearly collided with him at the edge of the rose bushes. "Your Grace," she gasped, stepping back quickly and dropping into a hurried curtsy. "I did not see you there." "Forgive me, I could not sleep and thought some air might help." "Nor could I," Alexander admitted. "It seems we have that in common tonight." Eliza glanced nervously toward the manor, as though worried someone might be watching from the windows. "I should return inside. It would not do for anyone to see me out here alone with you, Your Grace." "Please," Alexander said, taking a small step forward, careful not to close the distance too quickly and frighten her further. "Just a few minutes. There is so much I want to ask you, and I fear if you go back inside now, you will find every excuse to avoid me tomorrow, and the day after that." Eliza hesitated, her fingers unconsciously touching the iron ring on her hand. "What is it you wish to know?" "Everything," Alexander said simply. "Where you have been these past 20 years. What happened to your family after you left the estate? Whether you remember the orchard the way I do, or whether it truly was, as my mother suggested, nothing more than a childish fantasy. Eliza's eyes softened for just a moment, and Alexander thought he glimpsed, beneath her careful composure, the same girl who used to laugh freely among the apple trees, unburdened by the weight of servitude and social distance that now stood between them. "I remember everything, Your Grace," she said quietly, almost against her will. "Every summer afternoon, every story we invented, every promise we made to each other beneath those trees." Alexander's heart lifted at her words, but before he could respond, Eliza's expression clouded once more, and she took a step back, putting distance between them again. "But those were the promises of children," she continued, her voice growing firmer, more guarded. "We did not understand then what the world truly demands of people like us. You are a duke, Your Grace, and I am a maid in your household. Whatever we once shared beneath those apple trees cannot survive the reality of who we have become." "I do not accept that," Alexander said. "You must," Eliza said, and there was something almost desperate in her tone now, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as him. "I have worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to secure this position. I cannot risk everything for a memory, however dear that memory may be to me. Please, Your Grace, do not make this more difficult than it already is." Before Alexander could respond, Eliza turned and hurried back toward the servants' quarters, disappearing into the shadows of the manor. Alexander remained standing alone in the rose garden for a long while afterward, the moon climbing higher in the sky above him, his mind churning with questions that had only multiplied since their brief exchange. She remembered everything. She had just confirmed as much with her own words. But something in her past, something beyond the simple passage of years, had taught her to fear hope, to guard herself against the possibility of disappointment. Alexander was determined to discover what that something was, and more than that, he was determined to prove to Eliza that the promise he made her as a boy was not the fleeting fantasy of childhood innocence, but a bond he had carried with him, quietly and faithfully, through every year of their separation. As he finally turned to walk back toward the manor, a thought occurred to him that sent a cold chill down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the night air. His mother's explanation for the Hart family's sudden departure had been vague, almost deliberately so. An accident, she had called it, one that had somehow resulted in the entire family being relocated from the estate without warning or proper compensation. Alexander resolved, right then and there beneath the silver light of the moon, that he would uncover the full truth of what happened 20 years ago, no matter what secrets his own family might be hiding. Because he was beginning to suspect that Eliza's fear, her careful guardedness, her insistence that their childhood promise could never be fulfilled, was rooted in something far darker than simple social distance. It was rooted in an injustice that his own family had inflicted upon hers, an injustice that had shaped the entire course of Eliza Hart's difficult life. And Alexander intended to make it right, whatever the cost to his own carefully arranged future. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, the kind of quiet weather that seemed to hang over Ashcombe Manor like an unspoken warning. Alexander rose before dawn, unable to sleep, his mind still turning over every word Eliza had spoken to him in the rose garden the night before. He dressed quickly and made his way down to the estate's old records room, a dusty chamber tucked beneath the east wing where decades of ledgers, correspondence, and household accounts were stored in tall wooden cabinets. He had rarely set foot in this room during his lifetime. As a boy, it had seemed a forgotten, uninteresting place, full of dry paperwork that held no appeal for a child eager to escape into the orchard. Now, as a grown man determined to uncover the truth about Edmund Hart, Alexander found himself grateful that the estate's meticulous record-keeping had never wavered, even during his father's tenure. He began searching through ledgers dated roughly 20 years earlier, running his finger down columns of neatly written entries listing wages, repairs, and household expenditures. It took nearly an hour of careful searching before he found what he was looking for, a brief entry buried within a ledger otherwise filled with mundane details about roof repairs and stable expenses. Compensation paid to E. Hart, former gardener, following incident on estate grounds. Amount £12. £12. Alexander stared at the number, his stomach tightening with a growing unease. He knew enough about household finances to understand that £12 was an insultingly small sum, particularly for a family that had apparently been asked to leave their home and livelihood behind entirely. He continued searching, hoping to find additional records that might explain the nature of the incident referenced in the ledger. Eventually, tucked behind a stack of older documents, he found a folded letter, yellowed with age, addressed to his late father from a physician in the nearby village. The handwriting was formal and precise, clearly written by someone accustomed to documenting medical matters with careful detail. The letter described an injury sustained by Edmund Hart while repairing a section of stone wall near the estate's eastern boundary. According to the physician, a portion of the wall had collapsed unexpectedly, striking Hart and causing significant damage to his leg. The physician recommended an extended period of rest and proper medical care to ensure the leg healed correctly, warning that without such care, Hart risked permanent disability. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he read further. A second letter, dated several weeks after the first, revealed that his father had decided against providing the recommended medical care, instead offering the family a small sum of money and informing them that their services would no longer be required on the estate, given that a gardener unable to perform physical labor was of no use to the household. The cruelty of it struck Alexander like a physical blow. His father had not simply relocated a family due to unfortunate circumstances, as his mother had suggested. His father had dismissed an injured man from his position, denied him proper medical treatment, and sent the entire family away with barely enough money to survive, all because Edmund Hart could no longer perform the physical labor the estate required of him. Alexander sat back in his chair, the letters clutched tightly in his hands, feeling a wave of shame wash over him that he had never experienced before. He thought about young Eliza, no more than 8 or 9 years old at the time, watching her father struggle with an injury that the estate had refused to properly treat, watching her family's entire world collapse because his own father valued a stone wall repair schedule more than the well-being of the people who served him. He needed to know what happened after the family left the estate. He needed to understand how an injured gardener and his family had survived in the years that followed, and how that survival had eventually led Eliza back to Ashcombe Manor, working as a maid in the very household that had once cast her family aside. Alexander gathered the letters carefully, tucking them into his coat pocket, and made his way toward the kitchen, where he knew the household staff would already be preparing breakfast for the family. He found Nora overseeing the morning preparations, directing the kitchen maids with brisk efficiency. "Nora, might I have a word?" Alexander said, and something in his tone must have conveyed the seriousness of his request, because Nora immediately set down the tray she had been arranging and followed him into the adjoining pantry, away from the ears of the other servants. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" Nora asked, her expression concerned. "I need to know more about Eliza Hart's history before she came to work here," Alexander said. "Where has she been living these past 20 years? What happened to her family after they left the estate?" Nora hesitated, clearly uncertain whether she should share such personal information about a member of her staff. "Your Grace, I do not think it is my place to discuss such matters." "Please, Nora," Alexander said, his voice softening. "I promise you my intentions are honorable. I simply need to understand what happened so that I might do right by her family, whatever that may require." Something in his sincerity must have convinced the housekeeper, because she finally relented, glancing toward the pantry door to ensure they were not overheard. "From what I understand, Your Grace, the Hart family struggled greatly after leaving the estate. Mr. Hart's leg never healed properly, and he was unable to find steady work afterward. The family moved several times, always searching for cheaper lodgings, always falling further behind. Mrs. Hart took in sewing work to help make ends meet, and Eliza herself began working as a scullery maid in various households from a very young age, as soon as she was old enough to be hired. "And her father?" Alexander asked quietly. "Is he still living?" Nora's expression grew somber. "He passed away several years ago, Your Grace, from complications related to the old injury, or so I have heard. Eliza has been the primary provider for her mother ever since, moving from position to position, always seeking better wages to support them both. She came to us only recently, having heard through a friend that Ashcombe Manor was seeking additional household staff. I do not believe she realized, when she accepted the position, that it would mean returning to the very estate her family once served." Alexander felt the weight of this information settle heavily upon him. Eliza had spent the better part of 2 decades struggling to survive, watching her father slowly decline from an injury that his own family could have easily treated, had they only shown a fraction of compassion toward the people who worked their land. And now, desperate for steady employment, she had unknowingly returned to the household that had caused her family's suffering in the first place. No wonder she had been so guarded the previous evening. No wonder she had insisted their childhood promise belonged to a different life, one that could never be reconciled with the harsh realities she had faced ever since. She likely harbored resentment toward his family, perhaps even toward him personally, despite whatever fondness remained from their shared childhood memories. "Thank you, Nora," Alexander said quietly. "Please, do not mention this conversation to Eliza or to my mother. I need time to consider what must be done." Nora nodded, though her curious expression suggested she had many more questions she was too discreet to ask. Alexander left the pantry and made his way back toward the study, his mind racing with the implications of everything he had just learned. He found his mother already awake, seated at the breakfast table in the small morning room, reading correspondence while sipping her tea. She glanced up as he entered, her sharp eyes immediately noting his troubled expression. "You look as though you have not slept at all," Margaret observed. Alexander sat down across from her, the letters still tucked in his coat pocket, though he did not yet reveal them. "Mother, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Margaret set down her teacup, folding her hands in her lap with the composed patience of a woman who had spent decades navigating difficult conversations. "Very well. Ask your question." "Did you know that Edmund Hart's injury left him permanently disabled, and that father refused to provide proper medical care before dismissing him from his position?" Margaret's composure faltered just slightly before she recovered herself. "Your father made decisions regarding estate management that were his alone, Alexander. I had little influence over such matters, particularly concerning staff wages and injuries." "That is not an answer to my question," Alexander said firmly. "Did you know?" There was a long pause before Margaret finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "I knew there had been an injury. I knew your father decided against the expense of extended medical treatment, believing it an unnecessary burden on the estate's finances. I did not fully understand, at the time, the extent of the man's condition, nor did I concern myself with the family's circumstances after they departed. It was, I believed, simply a matter of estate management, nothing more. A man's leg was permanently damaged because father refused to pay for proper treatment," Alexander said, his voice rising slightly despite his effort to remain calm. "He died years later from complications related to that same injury, and his family was left to survive on £12 and whatever work Eliza could find as a young girl, scrubbing floors in strangers' homes." Margaret's face paled visibly. "Alexander, I did not know the full extent of their suffering. Your father handled these matters privately, and I confess I never inquired further, believing it was not my concern." "Well, it is my concern now," Alexander said, standing from the table. "And I intend to make amends for what this family has suffered, regardless of how uncomfortable that may make you or anyone else in this household." "Alexander, be reasonable," Margaret said, rising as well, her earlier composure now fully cracked with genuine alarm. "You cannot simply undo the past, And you certainly cannot allow personal feelings toward a housemaid to interfere with your responsibilities to this family and to your future betrothal with Lady Cordelia. I have made no promises to Lady Cordelia, Alexander reminded her again, his patience thinning. And whatever responsibilities I hold toward this family, do not absolve me of the responsibility to correct a grave injustice that this same family caused to an innocent man and his children. Margaret opened her mouth to argue further, but Alexander was already walking toward the door, his mind made up. He needed to speak with Eliza again, to tell her what he had discovered, though he suspected she likely knew every painful detail of her family's suffering far better than any ledger or letter could convey. He found her later that morning in the linen room, folding freshly laundered sheets with quick, practiced movements. She glanced up when he entered, her expression immediately guarded once more. "Your Grace, I do not think it wise for you to be here," Eliza said, setting down the sheet she had been folding. "I know what happened to your father," Alexander said without preamble. "I found the letters this morning. I know he was injured while repairing the estate wall, and I know my father refused to provide proper medical treatment before dismissing him with almost nothing to show for years of loyal service." Eliza's hands stilled at her sides. For a long moment she said nothing, her green eyes searching Alexander's face as though trying to determine whether his words were genuine or simply another empty gesture from a man who had grown up in comfort while her own family struggled to survive. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked, her voice tight with an emotion she seemed determined to suppress. "Because you deserve to know that I understand now," Alexander said. "I understand why you have every reason to resent my family, and perhaps even to resent me. I understand why the promise we made as children must seem like a cruel joke, given everything your family endured because of decisions my father made without any regard for the people who depended on him." Eliza's composure finally cracked, tears welling in her eyes despite her clear determination not to let them fall in front of him. "My father died still believing your family had simply forgotten about us, that we meant nothing to the people we served for years. He worked himself into an early grave trying to provide for us, despite the pain in his leg, because there was no other choice. My mother has never fully recovered from the loss, and I have spent every single day since trying to keep us both from falling into complete ruin." "I am so deeply sorry," Alexander said, and the sincerity in his voice seemed to catch her off guard. "I cannot undo what my father did to your family, but I intend to make things right, however that may be possible. And I want you to know that the promise I made you all those years ago was never a joke to me, Eliza. It was the truest thing I ever said as a child, and some part of me has never stopped believing it. Even during the years I convinced myself it was nothing more than a foolish fantasy." Eliza wiped quickly at her eyes, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "Your Grace, please, I cannot allow myself to hope for something that will only end in further heartbreak. I have built a life around practicality and survival. I cannot risk everything on the possibility that a duke might actually intend to honor a promise made when he was merely a boy who knew nothing of the world's true expectations." "Then let me prove it to you," Alexander said. "Give me the chance to show you that I am not the same family that wronged yours. Give me the chance to make amends, and to prove that some promises are worth keeping, regardless of what society expects." Eliza stared at him for a long moment, torn between the guarded caution that had protected her through years of hardship, and the small, fragile hope that his words had somehow managed to rekindle, despite her best efforts to suppress it. "I do not know if I can trust that hope again, Your Grace," she finally said quietly. "But I also find that I cannot simply dismiss it, no matter how much wisdom tells me that I should." It was not an acceptance, but it was not a rejection either, and Alexander found himself holding onto that small opening with the same desperate determination he had once held onto a crudely made iron ring 20 years earlier, believing with the whole innocent heart of a child that some promises were meant to be kept, no matter how much time or distance stood in the way. As he left the linen room that afternoon, Alexander understood that the path ahead would not be simple. His mother's opposition would only intensify. The arrangement with Lady Cordelia loomed over him like an obligation he could no longer ignore forever. And Eliza's understandable fear of hoping for something that might never come to pass would require patience and unwavering sincerity to overcome. But for the first time in 20 years, Alexander felt something close to certainty settle within him, a quiet conviction that the promise he had made beneath the apple trees of his childhood was not merely a fantasy to be discarded, but a truth he intended to honor, whatever the cost to his own carefully arranged future. News travels quickly within the walls of a great estate, and it did not take long before whispers of the Duke's strange fascination with the new housemaid began circulating among the staff. Grace, a young kitchen maid who had befriended Eliza during her short time at Ashcombe Manor, found her one evening in the small room they shared beneath the servants' quarters, sitting quietly on her narrow bed, with the iron ring turning slowly between her fingers. "You have not touched your supper," Grace said, settling onto the edge of her own bed across the narrow room. "Everyone below stairs is talking about you, you know. About the way the Duke looked at you during tea yesterday, and how he was seen speaking with you alone in the rose garden last night." "People should mind their own business," Eliza said, though there was no real anger in her voice, only weariness. "I am not trying to pry," Grace said gently. "I only worry for you. This sort of attention from a man of his position rarely ends well for a woman like us. Either he grows bored and moves on, leaving you to face whatever scandal remains, or worse, he simply takes what he wants without any thought of consequence for you." Eliza set the ring down on the small table beside her bed. "It is not like that, Grace. Alexander and I knew each other as children, before my family left the estate." Grace's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You knew the Duke as a child. You never mentioned this before." "I did not think it mattered," Eliza said. "It was so long ago, and I never expected our paths to cross again, let alone under these circumstances. I certainly never expected him to remember me after all these years." "But he does remember you," Grace said. "Clearly, quite vividly, if the stories are to be believed." Eliza sighed, running her fingers through her loosened hair. "He remembers a promise we made as children, foolish and impossible even then, though neither of us understood that at the time. He seems to believe that promise still means something now, despite everything that has changed between us." "And what do you believe?" Grace asked. Eliza did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting toward the small window that overlooked the darkened gardens below. "I believe that hope is a dangerous thing for people in our position, Grace. I have spent my entire life learning to survive on practicality rather than dreams. I cannot afford to believe in promises made by dukes, however sincere they may seem in the moment." "But you have not told him to stop," Grace observed quietly. "If you truly believed this was hopeless, would you not have simply asked him to leave you be once and for all?" Eliza had no answer for that, because some small, stubborn part of her heart refused to let go entirely of the hope that Alexander's words had reawakened, despite every practical instinct telling her that such hope could only lead to further heartbreak. Meanwhile, in a different wing of the manor, Alexander sat in his private study, poring over additional estate records he had gathered throughout the day. He had spoken with the old groundskeeper, Walter, a man who had served the estate for nearly 40 years, and who remembered the Hart family with genuine fondness. "Edmund Hart was one of the finest gardeners this estate has ever employed," Walter told Alexander, his weathered face creasing with old sorrow as he recalled the events of 2 decades past. "A hard-working man devoted to his family. It was a great injustice, what happened to him, Your Grace, though I confess I never had the courage to speak against your father's decisions at the time. I was young myself, and afraid of losing my own position if I raised objections." "You need not apologize for that, Walter," Alexander said. "You could hardly have changed my father's mind even if you had spoken out. I am simply grateful for whatever memories you can share with me now." Walter nodded slowly. "I remember young Eliza well, Your Grace. A bright, curious girl, always chasing after you through the orchard whenever your tutors were not watching. The two of you were inseparable that final summer before everything changed. Do you know what became of the family after they left? Alexander asked. Only rumors over the years, Walter admitted. I heard they struggled greatly, moving from town to town, always searching for cheaper lodgings and steadier work. It grieved me to hear such things, knowing how loyally Edmund had served this estate for so many years before his injury. Alexander thanked the old groundskeeper for his honesty, and spent the remainder of the evening drafting a plan, one that he hoped might begin to address the injustice his family had inflicted upon the Hart family so many years earlier. He resolved to establish a proper pension for Eliza's mother, along with a formal apology on behalf of the estate for the mistreatment her late husband had suffered. It would not undo the years of hardship the family had endured, but it was, Alexander believed, a necessary first step toward genuine amends. He also began quietly making inquiries about breaking off the informal arrangement with Lady Cordelia Ashford, though he knew such a decision would need to be handled delicately, given the social expectations surrounding such matters. He had no desire to embarrass Lady Cordelia publicly, nor to create unnecessary scandal for either family, but he also could not, in good conscience, proceed with a match built entirely on social convenience rather than genuine affection, particularly now that his heart had been so thoroughly reawakened by Eliza's unexpected return. The following days passed in a delicate rhythm of stolen conversations and cautious rebuilding of trust between Alexander and Eliza. He made a point of visiting the kitchen each morning under the pretense of requesting particular meals, using the opportunity to exchange brief words with Eliza whenever the other staff were occupied elsewhere. She remained guarded, careful never to allow their conversations to stretch too long or grow too familiar in front of watching eyes. But Alexander noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that her initial wariness had begun to soften ever so slightly with each passing day. One afternoon, nearly a week after their reunion in the drawing room, Alexander found Eliza alone in the estate's small chapel, kneeling before the modest altar with her head bowed in quiet prayer. He hesitated at the entrance, reluctant to disturb her private moment, but she must have sensed his presence, because she looked up before he could retreat. "Forgive me," Alexander said quickly. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding, Your Grace," Eliza said, rising from the kneeler. "I often come here when my thoughts grow too heavy to carry alone." "May I ask what troubles you today?" Alexander asked, stepping cautiously into the small chapel. Eliza hesitated before answering. "I received a letter from my mother this morning. Her health has been declining these past months, and the physician's fees continue to grow beyond what my wages here can cover. I fear I may need to seek additional employment, perhaps even leave this position entirely, if her condition does not improve." Alexander's chest tightened at this news. "Eliza, please, allow me to help. I could arrange for a physician from the village to visit your mother at no cost to either of you." "I cannot accept such charity, Your Grace," Eliza said firmly, though there was clear exhaustion beneath her resolute tone. "I have spent my entire life avoiding dependence on the goodwill of others. I could not bear the shame of accepting such help now, particularly from your family." "It is not charity," Alexander insisted. "It is restitution long overdue for the harm my family caused your father all those years ago. Please, Eliza, allow me this small measure of justice, if nothing else." Eliza studied his face for a long moment, clearly torn between her fierce pride and the desperate need to secure proper care for her ailing mother. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained conflicted. "If you truly believe it is restitution rather than charity, then I suppose I cannot refuse, not when my mother's well-being depends upon it." Alexander felt a small measure of relief at her acceptance, understanding how difficult it must have been for a woman as proud and self-reliant as Eliza to accept any form of help, regardless of its intended purpose. He immediately arranged for Dr. Bennett, a respected physician from the nearby village, to visit Eliza's mother at the modest cottage where she resided, promising to cover whatever costs might arise from her ongoing treatment. As the days passed, Alexander found himself growing increasingly determined to formalize his intentions, both toward Eliza and toward the broader task of correcting the injustice his family had inflicted upon her father. He requested a private meeting with his mother, insisting that the time had come to discuss the future of his betrothal arrangements openly and honestly. "You cannot be serious about pursuing this housemaid," Margaret said, her voice tight with disapproval as she paced the length of her private sitting room. "The scandal alone would be catastrophic for this family's reputation, Alexander. Lord Ashford would be humiliated by such a public rejection of his daughter, and society would never let either of us forget it." "I understand the risks, Mother," Alexander said calmly. "But I cannot proceed with a marriage built entirely on social convenience while denying my own heart the possibility of genuine happiness. And more than that, I cannot continue benefiting from a family fortune built, in part, on the suffering of people like the Harts, without at least attempting to correct that wrong." "You speak as though your father's decisions 20 years ago somehow implicate your entire future," Margaret said. "Alexander, be reasonable. These matters of estate management are complicated. Difficult decisions must sometimes be made for the greater good of the household." "There was nothing complicated about refusing proper medical care to an injured man who had served this family loyally for years," Alexander said, his voice sharpening. "That was simple cruelty, Mother, dressed up in the language of practical estate management. I refuse to continue pretending otherwise, and I refuse to build my own future on a foundation of similar callousness." Margaret fell silent, clearly struggling to find a counterargument that might sway her son from his increasingly resolute position. Finally, she sighed, sinking into a nearby chair with visible weariness. "What is it you intend to do, then?" "Abandon the arranged match with Lady Cordelia entirely, in favor of pursuing a housemaid, regardless of the consequences to this family's standing. I intend to pursue what my heart has always known to be true, even during the years I convinced myself otherwise," Alexander said quietly. "And I intend to do right by a family this house has wronged, regardless of what society may think of my decision." Margaret studied her son for a long moment, something shifting behind her sharp eyes, though she did not yet voice whatever conclusion she had reached. "You are as stubborn as your father was, in his own way, though I confess I find myself somewhat relieved that your stubbornness, at least, seems rooted in conscience rather than cruelty." It was not an endorsement, but it was, Alexander recognized, a small crack in his mother's fierce opposition, one that gave him a measure of hope that perhaps, given enough time and patience, even Margaret might eventually come to accept the path he had chosen to walk. That evening, as the household settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Alexander found himself once again in the rose garden where the old orchard had once stood, waiting in the hope that Eliza might find her way there as well. He was not disappointed. She appeared some time later, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her expression softer than he had seen it since their reunion. "My mother's health has already begun improving, thanks to Dr. Bennet's care," Eliza said, approaching him slowly. "I do not know how to properly thank you for such kindness, Your Grace." "You need not thank me," Alexander said. "It is the very least I owe your family, after everything you have endured because of decisions my father made without any regard for your well-being." Eliza was quiet for a moment, studying the moonlit roses that had replaced the orchard of their childhood. "Do you ever wonder what our lives might have looked like if my family had never been forced to leave this place?" "Often," Alexander admitted. "I have wondered it nearly every day since I saw that ring on your finger." "I wonder it too," Eliza confessed softly, "though I have tried for years to convince myself it was foolish to dwell on such impossible thoughts." "Perhaps they are not so impossible as we once believed," Alexander said, taking a careful step closer to her. "Perhaps it is not too late to build the life we once imagined together, beneath these very same grounds, even if the orchard itself has long since disappeared." Eliza looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the soft moonlight, and for the first time since their unexpected reunion, Alexander saw something genuine flicker across her features, something that looked remarkably like the fragile, cautious beginning of hope. "I want to believe that, Alexander," she said quietly, using his given name for the first time since her return to the estate. "I want to believe it more than I have wanted anything in a very long time." "Then let me help you believe it," Alexander said. "Give me the chance to prove, through actions rather than simply words, that the promise we made as children was never merely a fantasy, but a truth worth fighting for, regardless of what obstacles still stand between us." Eliza did not answer immediately, but she also did not step away, and in the quiet stillness of the moonlit garden, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile but undeniable rekindling of the bond they had shared so many years earlier, before the cruelty of circumstance had torn their childhood friendship apart. Neither of them could yet know how many challenges still lay ahead, how fiercely society and family obligation would resist the union they both secretly longed for. But in that quiet moment, beneath the moonlit roses, Alexander and Eliza allowed themselves, for the first time in 20 years, to genuinely hope that their childhood promise might yet find its way toward fulfillment. Word of the Duke's growing attachment to the housemaid eventually reached ears far beyond the walls of Ashcombe Manor. It was Aunt Beatrice, ever eager to involve herself in family matters, who first mentioned the rumors during a visit to Lord Ashford's estate, unable to resist sharing the curious tale of Alexander's strange fascination with a servant girl who had once lived on the grounds as a child. Lord Ashford, a proud and somewhat rigid man, did not take the news well. He arrived at Ashcombe Manor unannounced only 2 days later, demanding an audience with Margaret to discuss what he termed a matter of grave concern for his daughter's reputation and future. "I have heard troubling rumors, Your Grace," Lord Ashford said, seated stiffly across from Margaret in the formal drawing-room, his expression tight with barely restrained irritation. "Rumors suggesting your son has developed an inappropriate attachment to one of your household maids. I trust these rumors are nothing more than idle gossip, unworthy of serious consideration." Margaret's expression remained carefully composed, though Alexander, standing near the fireplace, could sense the tension coiled beneath her calm exterior. "Lord Ashford, I assure you, whatever rumors have reached your ears have been greatly exaggerated. My son is simply preoccupied with certain estate matters at present." "Estate matters," Lord Ashford repeated skeptically, glancing toward Alexander with narrowed eyes. "Perhaps the Duke himself might clarify these estate matters for me directly." Alexander stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. "Lord Ashford, I have great respect for your family and for Lady Cordelia. However, I must be honest with you now, rather than allow this matter to fester into greater misunderstanding later. I have reconnected with someone from my childhood, someone whose family suffered a grave injustice at the hands of my own father many years ago. I intend to correct that injustice, whatever the personal cost may be." Lord Ashford's face reddened with growing anger. "Are you telling me, Your Grace, that you intend to abandon the arrangement with my daughter in favor of pursuing a common housemaid?" "I have made no formal commitment to Lady Cordelia," Alexander reminded him, though he understood how little comfort such a technicality would provide to a man who clearly believed the match had already been all but settled. "I regret any confusion my actions may have caused, and I certainly never intended to bring dishonor upon your family's name. But I cannot, in good conscience, proceed with a marriage that would deny both myself and Lady Cordelia the possibility of genuine happiness elsewhere." Lord Ashford rose sharply from his seat, his expression thunderous. "This is an outrage. My daughter has been humiliated by this entire affair, made a laughingstock among our social circle because of your inability to control your own foolish sentiments. I demand a formal apology, at the very least, and full compensation for the damage done to my family's reputation." "You shall have both, Lord Ashford," Alexander said calmly, refusing to be baited into an angrier confrontation. "I take full responsibility for any distress this situation has caused Lady Cordelia, and I am prepared to offer whatever reasonable compensation you believe appropriate. However, I will not be swayed from the decision I have made, regardless of the consequences to my own reputation." Lord Ashford stormed from the manor shortly afterward, his parting words promising that Alexander would come to regret his foolish decision once society learned the full extent of his scandalous behavior. Margaret remained seated in the drawing room long after his departure, her expression a complicated mixture of frustration and something else Alexander could not quite identify. "You have made a powerful enemy today," Margaret finally said. "Lord Ashford will not rest until he has made this family suffer for the perceived slight against his daughter." "I understand the risk," Alexander said, "but I could not, in good conscience, continue leading Lady Cordelia toward a future I never intended to fully commit to, particularly now that I understand my true feelings so clearly." Margaret studied her son for a long moment before finally speaking again, her voice quieter than Alexander had heard in years. "Your father would have handled this situation quite differently, I imagine. He rarely allowed conscience to interfere with matters of practical advantage." "Perhaps that is precisely why I must handle it differently," Alexander said. News of the broken arrangement spread quickly through the upper echelons of society, and within days, whispers of scandal had reached even the servants' quarters of Ashcombe Manor. Grace found Eliza in the linen room one afternoon, her expression grave with concern. "Have you heard the news?" Grace asked. "The Duke has ended his arrangement with Lady Cordelia Ashford. Lord Ashford is furious, and society is already buzzing with speculation about the reason behind it." Eliza's hands stilled over the sheets she had been folding. "I had not heard the formal announcement, though I suspected something of the sort might happen, given everything Alexander has told me these past weeks." "They say it is because of you," Grace said carefully. "The other servants are already whispering that the Duke intends to pursue a relationship with you instead, regardless of the scandal it might bring upon this household." Eliza felt a familiar wave of fear rise within her, the same fear that had plagued her since the moment Alexander first recognized the ring on her finger. She had allowed herself, over these past weeks, to gradually believe that perhaps their childhood promise might genuinely be fulfilled. But the reality of an actual scandal, with real consequences for both Alexander's family and her own precarious position, suddenly felt far more frightening than the abstract hope she had been nurturing in quiet moments beneath the moonlit roses. "This is exactly what I feared," Eliza said, sinking onto the edge of her bed. "I never wanted to be the cause of such public humiliation for anyone, least of all a family as respected as Lord Ashford's." "You are not the cause of anything," Grace said firmly, sitting beside her friend. "The Duke made his own choice, freely and deliberately. You cannot blame yourself for decisions that belong entirely to him." But Eliza could not shake the guilt that settled over her in the following days, particularly as she began noticing the subtle shift in how other servants treated her. Some regarded her with newfound curiosity, eager for any scrap of gossip about her connection to the Duke. Others regarded her with thinly veiled resentment, clearly believing she had somehow schemed her way into the Duke's affections for personal gain. The whispers grew louder each day, and Eliza found herself increasingly isolated within the household, caught between the servants who now viewed her with suspicion and the family members who regarded her presence with open disapproval. Only Grace remained steadfastly loyal, offering quiet companionship during the increasingly difficult days that followed. Alexander, for his part, remained resolute in his intentions, continuing to visit Eliza whenever circumstances allowed, though the growing scandal made such visits increasingly difficult to arrange discreetly. He also continued working diligently to formalize the pension arrangement for Eliza's mother, along with a broader initiative to review the wages and working conditions of all estate staff, determined to ensure that no other family would suffer the same injustice that had befallen the Harts 20 years earlier. But the mounting pressure from society, combined with his mother's persistent concerns about the family's reputation, began weighing heavily upon Alexander as well. He found himself summoned before his mother once again, this time joined by his father's old solicitor, a stern man named Mr. Caldwell, who had been tasked with reviewing the legal and financial implications of the broken betrothal arrangement. "Your Grace, I must advise you that Lord Ashford is threatening formal legal action, citing breach of an implied marital contract," Mr. Caldwell explained, his tone grave. While no formal documents were ever signed, the social and financial implications of such a public dispute could prove quite damaging to this family's standing, particularly given the additional scandal surrounding your association with a household servant. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Caldwell?" Alexander asked. "I am suggesting, Your Grace, that a swift and generous settlement with Lord Ashford, combined with a period of discretion regarding your personal affairs, would go a long way toward mitigating the damage already done to this family's reputation," Mr. Caldwell said carefully. "Perhaps it would be wise to allow the current scandal to fade from public attention before pursuing any further public association with the housemaid in question." Alexander felt a flare of frustration at the solicitor's carefully worded suggestion, understanding full well what was truly being asked of him. Discretion, in this context, meant abandoning Eliza entirely, or at the very least, concealing his true intentions until society had moved on to some other scandal worthy of gossip. "I appreciate your counsel, Mr. Caldwell," Alexander said firmly. "However, I have no intention of concealing my true feelings simply to appease society's expectations. I will settle whatever reasonable compensation Lord Ashford demands, but I will not abandon my commitment to Eliza Hart, regardless of the social consequences." Margaret, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice carrying a note of weary resignation. "Alexander, I fear your stubbornness on this matter may cost this family far more than mere social embarrassment. Have you considered the possibility that continued scandal might affect the estate's business relationships, the marriages of your younger cousins, the standing of this entire family for generations to come?" "I have considered it, Mother," Alexander said, "and I have concluded that I would rather face temporary scandal now than spend the rest of my life living a lie, married to a woman I do not love, while denying the one person who has ever truly understood my heart." The conversation ended without resolution, Margaret's concerns unaddressed and Alexander's resolve unshaken. But the pressure continued to mount in the days that followed, as more details of the scandal reached the wider public, embellished and distorted through countless retellings, until the story bore little resemblance to the truth of what had actually transpired between Alexander and Eliza. Some versions of the rumor suggested that Eliza had deliberately schemed to seduce the Duke, using knowledge of their childhood connection to manipulate him into abandoning his betrothal. Other versions painted Alexander as a reckless young duke, throwing away his family's carefully cultivated reputation for a fleeting infatuation with an unsuitable woman. Neither version captured the genuine history and complicated emotions that truly bound the two of them together, but the damage to both their reputations continued regardless. Eliza, increasingly overwhelmed by the mounting scandal and the isolation she faced within the household, began seriously considering whether she should simply resign from her position and disappear from Alexander's life entirely, sparing them both further public humiliation. She confided this growing fear to Grace one evening, her voice heavy with exhaustion and doubt. "Perhaps it would be better for everyone if I simply left," Eliza said. "Alexander could return his focus to more suitable arrangements, and this scandal would eventually fade from memory, given enough time." "Do you truly believe that is what he wants?" Grace asked gently. "I do not know what either of us truly wants anymore," Eliza admitted. "I only know that I cannot continue watching him sacrifice his family's reputation, his standing in society, everything he has ever known, simply because of a foolish promise made when we were children who understood nothing of the world's true expectations." "But you told me yourself that you believed that promise meant something," Grace reminded her, "that you wanted to believe it more than anything you have wanted in years." "Wanting something and being willing to destroy an entire family's reputation to pursue it are two very different things, Grace," Eliza said quietly. I cannot bear the thought that my presence in this household might cause irreparable harm to people who, despite everything, have shown me genuine kindness these past weeks. Grace fell silent, understanding the depth of her friend's internal conflict, though she privately hoped that Eliza would find the courage to hold on to the fragile hope that had begun blooming between her and the Duke, rather than allowing fear and guilt to extinguish it entirely before it had truly been given a fair chance to flourish. As the days continued to pass, the tension within Ashcombe Manor grew increasingly palpable, each member of the household bracing for whatever difficult decision still lay ahead, uncertain whether the fragile bond between Alexander and Eliza could withstand the mounting pressures of family expectation, social scandal, and the painful weight of history that still lingered between them. The tension within the household reached a breaking point on a rainy afternoon nearly 3 weeks after Lord Ashford's furious departure from Ashcombe Manor. Alexander had spent the morning reviewing the estate's financial records with Mr. Caldwell, finalizing the settlement that would formally resolve the broken arrangement with Lady Cordelia, when a servant informed him that his mother wished to speak with him urgently in the family library. He arrived to find Margaret standing near the tall windows, watching the rain streak down the glass, her posture unusually rigid even for a woman known for her composed demeanor. She turned as he entered, and Alexander immediately sensed that whatever news she carried was not going to be pleasant. "I have received a letter this morning," Margaret said, holding up a folded piece of paper, "from a solicitor representing Lord Ashford's interests. It seems our former friend has decided that a financial settlement alone will not satisfy his wounded pride. He intends to spread further rumors about this family, rumors that go beyond the simple truth of a broken betrothal." "What sort of rumors?" Alexander asked warily. "He intends to suggest that your father's business dealings over the years have been conducted with questionable ethics, implying that our family's fortune was built upon exploitation of vulnerable estate workers," Margaret said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He plans to use the story of the Hart family as evidence, twisting the truth of what happened to Edmund Hart into a broader accusation of systematic cruelty toward all our estate employees." Alexander felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. While the accusation was, in its essence, uncomfortably close to the truth regarding Edmund Hart's specific case, he understood the potential damage such widespread rumors could inflict, not only upon his family's reputation, but upon the very reforms he had been quietly working to implement for the benefit of all estate workers. "This could ruin the improvements I have been planning," Alexander said slowly. "If the estate becomes embroiled in public scandal over past mistreatment of workers, it may become impossible to secure the necessary funding and support to properly implement fair wages and working conditions going forward." "Precisely," Margaret said. "Lord Ashford's intention is clearly to inflict maximum damage upon this family, regardless of the collateral harm it might cause to the very workers you claim to wish to help." Alexander paced the length of the library, his mind racing through possible solutions to this rapidly escalating crisis. Perhaps the best course of action is complete transparency. Rather than allow Lord Ashford to control the narrative through distorted rumors, I could make a public statement acknowledging the mistreatment of the Hart family, along with a clear outline of the reforms I intend to implement going forward. "You would be handing Lord Ashford exactly the ammunition he seeks," Margaret warned. "A public admission of past wrongdoing would only fuel further scandal, regardless of your good intentions moving forward." "Perhaps," Alexander conceded, "but it would also demonstrate genuine accountability, rather than allowing this family to appear as though we are simply attempting to conceal past mistakes. I believe the public may respond more favorably to honest acknowledgement and concrete reform than to continued secrecy and denial." Margaret studied her son for a long moment, clearly weighing the potential risks and benefits of his proposed approach. "This is a considerable gamble, Alexander. If the public reacts poorly to such an admission, the damage to this family's reputation could prove far more severe than anything Lord Ashford might achieve through simple rumor and gossip." "I understand the risk," Alexander said, "but I have grown weary of allowing fear of scandal to dictate every decision this family makes. I would rather face the consequences of honesty than continue perpetuating the same culture of secrecy and denial that allowed my father to mistreat the Hart family in the first place." While Alexander and his mother debated the merits of public transparency, an entirely different crisis was unfolding within the servants' quarters. Eliza had received another letter from her mother that morning, one that carried far more troubling news than the previous correspondence regarding her declining health. Her mother's letter revealed that word of the scandal surrounding Eliza, and the Duke had somehow reached their small village, likely through the same channels of gossip that had spread the story throughout upper society. The neighbors, always eager to judge and speculate, had begun treating Eliza's mother with thinly veiled scorn, whispering behind her back about her daughter's supposed scheming to seduce a nobleman for personal gain. The letter described her mother's growing distress at these cruel rumors, compounded by her already fragile health, and included a desperate plea for Eliza to consider whether her continued pursuit of any relationship with the Duke was truly worth the mounting damage to both their reputations and her mother's peace of mind during what remained of her declining years. Eliza read the letter alone in the small room she shared with Grace, tears streaming silently down her face as she absorbed the full weight of her mother's words. She had endured years of hardship and struggle without complaint, always finding the strength to persevere for her mother's sake. But the thought of her mother suffering further humiliation and distress, because of Eliza's own fragile hope for happiness, felt like more than she could bear. She made her decision that evening, writing a brief note to Nora requesting permission to resign from her position at Ashcombe Manor, citing her mother's declining health as the primary reason for her departure. She had already arranged, through a brief correspondence with a former acquaintance, for a position as a companion to an elderly widow in a distant town, far removed from both the scandal and the painful proximity to Alexander that had complicated her life so thoroughly these past weeks. Grace discovered the packed bag beneath Eliza's bed the following morning, her expression stricken with dismay. "You cannot be serious about leaving. Not now, not like this, without even speaking to him first." "There is nothing left to discuss," Eliza said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and resignation. "My mother is suffering because of this scandal, and I cannot allow my own selfish hope for happiness to continue causing harm to the people I love most. It is time I accepted the reality of our situation and returned to a simpler life, far from all this complicated heartache." "But what about the Duke?" Grace asked. "What about everything he has done these past weeks, the pension for your mother, the broken arrangement with Lady Cordelia, all of it? Are you truly prepared to simply disappear without a word of explanation?" Eliza's resolve wavered momentarily at the mention of everything Alexander had sacrificed on her behalf, but she quickly steeled herself against the temptation to reconsider. "It is precisely because of everything he has already sacrificed that I must leave now, before the damage grows even worse. He deserves the chance to rebuild his reputation, and his family's standing without the continued burden of our complicated history weighing upon him." Grace could not persuade her friend to reconsider, and by midday, Eliza had quietly slipped away from Ashcombe Manor, leaving behind only a brief note explaining her sudden departure, addressed not to Alexander directly, but to Nora, requesting that her final wages be sent to her mother's address once her new position had been properly established. Alexander did not learn of Eliza's departure until later that evening, when he sought her out in the linen room, eager to share the details of his planned public statement regarding the mistreatment of the Hart family, only to be informed by a visibly distressed Nora that Eliza had resigned from her position and departed the estate without further explanation. "When did she leave?" Alexander demanded, his voice tight with rising panic. "Where has she gone?" "I do not know the specific destination, Your Grace," Nora said. "She mentioned only that she had secured a position elsewhere, and that her departure was necessary given the ongoing circumstances surrounding her presence in this household." Alexander immediately sought out Grace, correctly suspecting that the young kitchen maid would possess more detailed knowledge of Eliza's whereabouts. He found her in the kitchen, her expression grave with obvious concern for her friend. "Please, Grace, I need to know where she has gone," Alexander pleaded. "I cannot allow her to simply disappear, not without at least the chance to speak with her one final time." Grace hesitated, clearly torn between her loyalty to Eliza's wishes and her genuine concern that her friend was making a decision she might come to deeply regret. Finally, she relented, sharing what little information Eliza had confided regarding her planned departure and the approximate location of the distant town where she intended to begin her new position. "The train departs from the village station within the hour, Your Grace," Grace said. "If you hurry, you may still be able to reach her before she boards." Alexander did not waste another moment. He called for his fastest horse, ignoring the surprised protests of the stable hand, Simon, who scrambled to saddle the animal as quickly as possible. As Alexander mounted the horse and prepared to depart, his mother appeared at the manor's entrance, having been informed of the sudden commotion by one of the household staff. "Alexander, where on earth are you going in such haste?" Margaret called out. "Eliza has left the estate," Alexander shouted back, already turning the horse toward the long drive. "I intend to stop her before she boards the train, regardless of the consequences." Margaret's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession, surprise giving way to something that might have been reluctant admiration at her son's evident determination. "Then go quickly, before you lose the chance entirely," she called after him, her words carrying a note of genuine support that surprised Alexander even as he urged his horse into a full gallop down the rain-slicked drive. The journey to the village station felt agonizingly long, each passing minute increasing Alexander's fear that he might arrive too late, that Eliza would already be gone, disappearing into a life far removed from the promise they had once made beneath the apple trees of their shared childhood. The rain had finally begun to ease, though the roads remained muddy and treacherous, forcing Alexander to carefully balance speed against the very real risk of a dangerous fall. As he finally approached the small village station, his heart pounding with a mixture of exertion and desperate hope, Alexander caught sight of a familiar figure standing alone on the platform, a small traveling bag clutched tightly in her hands as she waited for the approaching train. "Eliza," he called out, dismounting his horse before it had fully come to a stop, ignoring the startled glances of other travelers waiting nearby on the platform. Eliza turned at the sound of his voice, her expression a complicated mixture of surprise, guilt, and something that looked remarkably like relief, despite her obvious efforts to maintain her composed resolve. "Alexander, you should not have come. This will only make everything more difficult." "I could not simply let you disappear without a proper explanation," Alexander said, approaching her slowly, his breathing still ragged from the desperate ride. "Please, Eliza, tell me why you have decided to leave so suddenly, without even a word of farewell." Eliza's composure finally began to crumble, tears welling in her eyes as she struggled to find the words to explain her decision. "My mother is suffering because of the rumors surrounding our connection. I cannot bear to watch her endure further humiliation and distress simply because of my own selfish hope for a happiness that seems increasingly impossible to achieve, given everything standing between us." "Nothing standing between us is more powerful than the truth of what we feel for each other," Alexander said firmly. "I know the scandal has been painful for both you and your mother, but I promise you, Eliza, I have no intention of allowing that scandal to define our future. I am prepared to make a public statement acknowledging the wrongs my family committed against yours, along with concrete plans to ensure such injustice never occurs again on this estate." "And what happens after that statement is made?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. "Will the scandal simply disappear? Will society suddenly accept a duke's marriage to a former housemaid without further judgment or cruelty?" "I do not know what society will ultimately accept," Alexander admitted honestly. "But I know that I cannot continue living a life defined by fear of judgment, particularly when that fear threatens to cost me the one person who has ever truly understood my heart. I love you, Eliza. I have loved you since we were children playing beneath the apple trees, and I have never stopped loving you, even during the years I convinced myself such love was nothing more than childish fantasy. The train's whistle sounded in the distance, signaling its imminent arrival, and Eliza glanced nervously toward the tracks, clearly torn between her carefully planned escape and the powerful pull of Alexander's heartfelt declaration. "I am frightened, Alexander," Eliza confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frightened of hoping for something that might ultimately be destroyed by forces far beyond our control." "Then let us face that fear together," Alexander said, closing the remaining distance between them and gently taking her hands in his own. "I cannot promise you that our path forward will be simple, but I can promise you that I will never again allow you to face such fear alone. Please, Eliza, do not board that train. Come home with me, and let us discover together whether the promise we made as children might yet find its way toward fulfillment." The train pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam, and for a long, agonizing moment, Eliza remained frozen, torn between the safety of her planned departure and the uncertain, but genuine hope that Alexander's words had reignited within her heart. Finally, she looked up at him, her green eyes shining with unshed tears, and made her decision. "I will stay," Eliza said, her voice trembling but resolute, as the train hissed to a halt beside the platform, its doors opening to passengers who hurried past the two of them without a second glance, too absorbed in their own journeys to notice the quiet drama unfolding nearby. "I will stay, Alexander, though I confess I do not yet know how we shall navigate everything that still stands in our way." Relief flooded through Alexander so powerfully that he felt momentarily unsteady on his feet. He gently released her hands only to draw her into a careful embrace, mindful of the curious onlookers still gathered on the platform, though he found he cared very little in that moment, for whatever gossip might result from such a public display of affection. "We shall navigate it together," Alexander said softly, "one difficulty at a time for as long as it takes." The train departed without Eliza aboard, and the two of them made their way back toward Ashcombe Manor, Alexander leading his tired horse by the reins while Eliza walked beside him, her traveling bag now feeling considerably lighter than it had when she first arrived at the station, resolved to leave everything behind. Their return to the manor did not go unnoticed. Margaret herself stood waiting near the entrance, having apparently been watching for their arrival with an anxiousness she rarely allowed herself to display so openly. When she saw Eliza walking beside her son, very much still present rather than departed, something in the Dowager Duchess's rigid posture seemed to soften, just slightly. "I am glad to see you have returned," Margaret said, addressing Eliza directly for the first time since their initial encounter in the drawing room weeks earlier. "Come inside, both of you. There is much to discuss, and I believe it would be wise to discuss it before the household staff have further opportunity to speculate about today's dramatic events." Over the following hours, seated together in the family library with cups of tea growing cold before them, Alexander, Eliza, and Margaret engaged in the most honest conversation the three of them had ever shared. Margaret listened, with visibly growing discomfort, as Eliza recounted the full extent of her family's suffering following their departure from the estate, the years of poverty, her father's slow decline, and the constant, exhausting struggle simply to survive. "I did not fully understand the depth of your family's hardship," Margaret admitted quietly, once Eliza had finished speaking. "I allowed myself, for many years, to believe that my husband's decisions regarding estate management were simply practical matters, unworthy of my personal concern. I see now how wrong that assumption truly was." "I do not say these things to seek your pity, Your Grace," Eliza said carefully. "I only wish for you to understand why I have found it so difficult to trust in the possibility of genuine happiness with your son, given everything my family endured because of decisions made within these very walls." "I understand," Margaret said, and to Alexander's genuine surprise, His mother's voice carried none of its usual sharp authority, only a quiet, contemplative sincerity that he had rarely witnessed in all his years living beneath her guidance. And I confess, watching my son ride off in such desperate haste today, prepared to abandon every social expectation in pursuit of a promise made 20 years ago, has forced me to reconsider many assumptions I have long held regarding duty, love, and the true meaning of family honor. Alexander watched this exchange with cautious hope, sensing that his mother's opposition, while not entirely extinguished, had at least begun to genuinely waver in the face of Eliza's evident sincerity and the depth of suffering her family had endured. "What do you propose we do now, Mother?" Alexander asked. "Regarding the ongoing scandal and Lord Ashford's threatened campaign against this family's reputation." Margaret considered the question for a long moment before responding. "I believe, given everything I have learned today, that your earlier proposal regarding public transparency may indeed be the wisest path forward. Rather than allowing Lord Ashford to control the narrative through distorted rumor, we should present the full truth ourselves, along with a clear demonstration of genuine remorse and concrete plans for reform." Alexander felt a surge of gratitude toward his mother, understanding what a significant shift this represented from her earlier insistence on discretion and social convenience above all else. "Thank you, Mother. This means more to me than I can properly express." "Do not thank me yet," Margaret said, a hint of her familiar sharpness returning to her voice. "Such a public statement will invite considerable scrutiny, and possibly further scandal, before matters ultimately improve. We must prepare carefully, ensuring that our message conveys genuine accountability rather than simply appearing as a desperate attempt to salvage our reputation." Over the following days, Alexander worked closely with his mother and Mr. Caldwell to draft a formal statement acknowledging the mistreatment of Edmund Hart and outlining a comprehensive set of reforms intended to improve wages, working conditions, and medical care for all estate employees going forward. The statement also included a formal pension arrangement for Eliza's mother, publicly acknowledged as restitution for the family's past suffering, along with an endowment establishing a fund to assist any estate worker injured while in service. The statement was published in the regional newspaper, accompanied by a personal letter from Alexander expressing genuine remorse for his father's past decisions, and his firm commitment to ensuring such injustice never occurred again under his own stewardship of the estate. He made no attempt to conceal his personal connection to Eliza Hart, choosing instead to acknowledge their childhood friendship honestly, while carefully avoiding any premature announcement regarding their current relationship, understanding that such matters required more delicate handling given the ongoing sensitivity of the situation. The public reaction, much to everyone's relief, proved considerably more favorable than Margaret had initially feared. While some segments of society continued to whisper judgmental gossip about the Duke's unconventional attachment to a former housemaid, a surprising number of readers responded with genuine admiration for Alexander's willingness to acknowledge past wrongdoing so openly, particularly given how rarely such transparency occurred among the aristocracy. Several prominent newspapers published editorials praising the Duke's evident commitment to reform, and Alexander received numerous letters from other estate owners expressing interest in implementing similar improvements for their own workers. Lord Ashford's planned campaign of damaging rumors lost much of its intended force, given that Alexander had already preemptively acknowledged the very issues Ashford had hoped to weaponize against the family's reputation. Lord Ashford, finding his intended scandal considerably diminished by Alexander's proactive transparency, ultimately settled for the financial compensation previously offered, choosing to quietly withdraw from further public confrontation rather than risk appearing petty or vindictive in the face of the family's apparent commitment to genuine reform. With the immediate crisis regarding Lord Ashford resolved, Alexander turned his attention toward rebuilding the fragile trust and affection that had begun blossoming between himself and Eliza before the scandal's disruptive intervention. He found her one afternoon in the estate's small chapel once again, though this time her expression carried a lightness he had not witnessed since their childhood days beneath the apple trees. "The other servants have been treating me quite differently these past few days," Eliza said, as Alexander settled beside her on the wooden pew. "It seems your public statement has shifted their perception of our situation considerably. Several have even offered their congratulations, assuming our future together is already a settled matter." "And what do you believe our future holds?" Alexander asked carefully. Eliza turned to face him fully, her green eyes searching his face with an openness she had not allowed herself to display since their initial reunion weeks earlier. "I believe, Alexander, that I am finally ready to allow myself the hope I have spent so many years refusing to entertain. I believe that the promise we made as children, however impossible it once seemed, may yet find its way toward fulfillment, if we are both willing to face whatever challenges still remain." Alexander felt his heart swell with a joy he had not experienced since he was a young boy playing carefree beneath the orchard trees, before the weight of duty and social expectation had settled so heavily upon his shoulders. "Then, let us face those challenges together, exactly as we promised each other, all those years ago." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, one he had commissioned from a jeweler in the nearby town only days earlier, uncertain until this very moment whether the timing would be right to present it. He opened the box carefully, revealing a delicate gold ring, far more refined than the crude iron band Eliza still wore on her finger, though it carried the same simple heart engraving that had first caught his attention weeks earlier. "Eliza Hart," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the nervous excitement coursing through him, "I made you a promise 20 years ago, beneath the apple trees of an orchard that no longer exists. I promised that one day I would marry you. I intend to keep that promise now, not because of duty or obligation, but because I have never loved anyone as deeply or as genuinely as I love you. Will you allow me the honor of finally fulfilling the promise of our childhood?" Tears streamed freely down Eliza's face now, though her expression carried none of the fear or guarded caution that had characterized their earlier encounters. Instead, her face radiated a joy so pure and unrestrained that Alexander felt certain, in that single perfect moment, that every difficulty they had faced these past weeks had been worth enduring simply to arrive at this precise point in time. "Yes," Eliza said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. I have wanted nothing more, since the day I first saw you standing in that drawing room, though I never allowed myself to believe such happiness might genuinely be possible." Alexander slipped the gold ring onto her finger, right beside the old iron band she had worn faithfully for 20 years, a physical testament to the promise they had made as children and the promise they now renewed as adults, finally free to pursue the future their hearts had always secretly desired. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Ashcombe Manor, and while some members of the extended family continued to harbor reservations about the unconventional match, the overwhelming reaction among the household staff was one of genuine joy and celebration. Grace, upon hearing the news from Eliza herself, threw her arms around her friend with unrestrained happiness, tears of joy streaming down her own face. "I knew it," Grace said, laughing through her tears. "I knew from the very beginning that this was no mere infatuation, but something far deeper and more genuine than mere scandal could ever diminish." Even Nora, the stern housekeeper who had initially been so eager to smooth over the awkward first encounter between Alexander and Eliza, offered her heartfelt congratulations, admitting privately to Grace that she had rarely witnessed such genuine devotion between two people, regardless of the significant differences in their social standing. Margaret, for her part, approached the engagement with a complicated mixture of continued reservation and grudging acceptance. She insisted upon a proper period of courtship before any formal wedding announcement, wishing to allow society sufficient time to adjust to the unconventional nature of the match, and she continued to express occasional concerns regarding the practical challenges Eliza might face in adapting to the formal responsibilities of a duchess. But beneath her careful, measured caution, Alexander noticed a genuine warmth developing in his mother's interactions with Eliza, particularly as Eliza demonstrated, time and again, a natural grace and quiet dignity that gradually won over even the most skeptical members of the extended family. Margaret began including Eliza in small family gatherings, offering gentle guidance regarding the social expectations she would need to navigate as future Duchess. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the relationship between the two women began to shift from wary tolerance toward something resembling genuine respect and affection. Several weeks after their engagement, Alexander proposed a particular idea to Eliza, one he had been contemplating since the earliest days of their reunion, when he first stood staring at the rose garden that had replaced the orchard of their childhood. "I would like to restore a portion of the old orchard," Alexander said, as the two of them walked together through the gardens one crisp autumn afternoon. Not the entire rose garden, but perhaps a small section near the eastern boundary, where we might plant new apple trees, as a tribute to the childhood friendship that ultimately brought us back together after so many years apart. Eliza's eyes brightened with genuine delight at the suggestion. "I would love nothing more, Alexander. It would be a beautiful way to honor both our shared history and my father's memory, given how devoted he was to tending these very grounds." Together, they selected a suitable location for the new orchard, and Alexander arranged for young apple saplings to be planted in careful rows, ensuring that within a few years, a genuine orchard would once again flourish upon the estate grounds, serving as a living tribute to the promise that had endured across 2 decades of separation, hardship, and eventual reunion. As autumn gradually gave way to the cooler days of early winter, wedding preparations began in earnest at Ashcombe Manor. Margaret, despite her earlier reservations, threw herself into the planning with surprising enthusiasm, determined to ensure that her son's wedding, however unconventional the circumstances surrounding it, would nonetheless proceed with all the elegant dignity befitting a duke's marriage. Eliza's mother, whose health had continued improving steadily under Dr. Bennet's careful attention, arrived at Ashcombe Manor for an extended visit, eager to witness her daughter's remarkable transformation from struggling housemaid to future duchess. The reunion between mother and daughter was tearful and joyous, and Alexander found himself deeply moved watching Eliza embrace her mother within the very halls that had once cast their family aside so cruelly. "Your father would have been so proud of you," Eliza's mother said, cupping her daughter's face gently in her weathered hands. "And so grateful, I imagine, to know that the promise made beneath his beloved orchard trees has finally found its way toward fulfillment." As the wedding date approached, drawing ever closer with each passing day, Alexander found himself reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this point. From the shattering of a simple teacup that first revealed Eliza's presence in his household, through the painful discoveries of his family's past injustice, the mounting scandal and social pressure, and finally, the joyous reconciliation that now promised a future neither of them had dared to imagine possible only months earlier. He understood that challenges still remained ahead, that adapting to her new role as Duchess would require considerable adjustment for Eliza, and that certain members of society would likely never fully accept the unconventional circumstances of their union. But standing together with Eliza in the newly planted orchard, watching the young saplings sway gently in the winter breeze, Alexander felt an unshakable confidence that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, they would face them together, exactly as they had promised each other so many years earlier, as two innocent children who somehow, against every reasonable expectation, had found their way back to each other after 20 long years apart. Not everyone within the extended Whitmore family greeted the news of the upcoming wedding with the same gradual acceptance that Margaret had eventually come to embrace. Alexander's cousin, a distant relation named Frederick who stood several places down the line of succession, arrived at Ashcombe Manor uninvited one blustery afternoon, his expression carrying the particular arrogance of a man who believed his own social standing entitled him to interfere in matters that did not truly concern him. "I must speak with you regarding this absurd marriage you intend to pursue," Frederick said, settling himself into a chair in Alexander's study without waiting for an invitation to do so. "Surely you understand the precedent you would be setting, Alexander, allowing a common servant to ascend to the position of Duchess. It undermines the very foundation upon which our family's standing has been built for generations." "I understand your concerns, Frederick," Alexander said evenly, though he felt little patience for his cousin's presumptuous interference. "But I fail to see how my personal choice of a wife affects your own standing within the family in any meaningful way." "It affects the perception of our entire lineage," Frederick insisted. "Other noble families will question whether the Whitmore name still commands the respect it once did, if the current Duke sees fit to marry so far beneath his station. I have even heard whispers that some legal scholars question whether such a marriage might create grounds for challenging the legitimacy of any future heirs, given the questionable precedent it establishes." Alexander felt a flicker of genuine concern at this particular threat, understanding the real legal complications that could arise if Frederick or other distant relations chose to pursue formal challenges regarding inheritance and succession. He resolved to consult immediately with Mr. Caldwell regarding the legal protections necessary to ensure that any children born from his union with Eliza would face no future challenges to their rightful inheritance. "I appreciate your concern for the family's legal standing, Frederick," Alexander said carefully. "However, I assure you that I have every intention of ensuring proper legal documentation is established, protecting the legitimate inheritance rights of any future children, regardless of their mother's origins. I would advise you against pursuing any legal challenge that might ultimately prove both costly and unsuccessful, given the thoroughness with which I intend to prepare such documentation." Frederick's expression soured further at Alexander's calm confidence, clearly having hoped to provoke a more defensive or uncertain response. "We shall see how confident you remain, Alexander, once society has had ample opportunity to fully judge this reckless decision." After Frederick's departure, Alexander immediately sought counsel with Mr. Caldwell, who assured him that proper legal documentation, drafted carefully and reviewed by multiple respected legal authorities, would indeed protect any future heirs from legitimate challenge, regardless of Eliza's origins as a former household servant. Alexander commissioned the necessary documents immediately, determined to eliminate any lingering uncertainty that might later complicate the security of his future family. Meanwhile, Margaret, having witnessed the exchange with Frederick through a partially open study door, found herself surprisingly protective of Eliza's position within the family, a sentiment that would have seemed entirely foreign to her only months earlier. "Frederick has always been rather insufferable," Margaret remarked to Alexander later that evening, as the two of them shared a quiet dinner together. "I confess, watching his attempt to interfere in your personal affairs has only strengthened my own resolve to see this marriage through, regardless of whatever lingering doubts I once harbored myself." "I am grateful for your support, Mother," Alexander said, genuinely touched by this evident shift in his mother's attitude. "It means more than you likely realize." "Do not grow too sentimental," Margaret said, though a faint smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I still intend to ensure Eliza receives proper instruction regarding the social expectations she will face as Duchess. But I have come to believe, watching her these past weeks, that she possesses a natural grace and genuine kindness that many women born into privilege entirely lack. Perhaps this family could benefit from precisely such qualities, rather than continuing to prioritize bloodline and social convention above genuine character." With Frederick's legal threats successfully neutralized, Margaret decided that the time had come to formally introduce Eliza to broader society through an elegant ball hosted at Ashcombe Manor, an event intended to demonstrate the family's continued social standing, while allowing Eliza the opportunity to prove her natural grace and dignity to the very society members who had previously judged her so harshly based on rumor and gossip alone. Eliza approached the preparation for this significant event with a mixture of excitement and considerable anxiety, understanding the weight of expectation resting upon her performance at such a public gathering. Margaret personally oversaw her instruction in the finer points of aristocratic etiquette, teaching her proper forms of address, appropriate conversation topics, and the subtle social cues that governed interactions among the nobility. "You need not pretend to be someone you are not," Margaret advised, during one particularly intensive session of preparation. "Your natural warmth and genuine curiosity about others are qualities that many in society sorely lack, myself included, for far too many years. Simply be yourself, Eliza, while remembering the formal courtesies expected of your new position." On the evening of the ball, Eliza descended the grand staircase of Ashcombe Manor wearing an elegant gown of deep emerald silk, a color Margaret had specifically selected to complement Eliza's striking green eyes. Alexander, waiting at the base of the staircase, felt his breath catch at the sight of her, struck once again by how naturally she seemed to embody genuine grace, regardless of the considerable social distance she had traveled from her humble beginnings as a household maid. The evening proceeded with considerable tension, as numerous guests, having heard countless rumors about the scandalous circumstances surrounding Alexander's engagement, watched Eliza's every movement with sharp, critical attention, eager to catch her in some social misstep that might confirm their assumptions regarding her unsuitability for the role she was preparing to assume. But Eliza, drawing upon Margaret's careful instruction, along with her own natural intelligence and genuine warmth, navigated the evening with a poise that gradually won over even the most skeptical observers. She engaged thoughtfully with elderly dowagers who had initially approached her with thinly veiled condescension, discussed literature and current events with knowledgeable confidence that surprised many who had assumed her education would prove sorely lacking, and treated every servant attending to the guests with the same genuine respect and kindness she extended to the assembled nobility. Lady Cordelia Ashford, whose presence at the ball surprised many given the circumstances of the broken betrothal, approached Eliza directly during a brief lull in the evening's festivities, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of lingering resentment and grudging curiosity. "I confess I was quite prepared to dislike you intensely," Lady Cordelia said, her tone carrying a directness that momentarily caught Eliza off guard. "Given everything that transpired regarding my own broken engagement, I believe I had every right to harbor such resentment." "I understand completely, Lady Cordelia," Eliza said carefully. "I never intended to cause you such humiliation, and I remain deeply sorry for whatever distress our situation may have caused you." Lady Cordelia studied her for a long moment before continuing. "Having now observed you this evening, I confess I find myself somewhat unable to maintain the resentment I had so carefully cultivated. You conduct yourself with genuine dignity, Miss Hart, rather than the calculated scheming that gossip had led me to expect. Perhaps Alexander's unconventional choice was wiser than society initially assumed." This unexpected exchange, witnessed by several observant guests, quickly spread throughout the remainder of the evening, gradually shifting the general perception among attendees from skeptical judgment toward genuine curiosity, and in many cases, reluctant admiration for Eliza's evident poise and character. By the evening's conclusion, even Frederick, who had attended reluctantly at Margaret's insistence, found himself unable to maintain his earlier hostility in the face of Eliza's evident success in winning over the assembled guests. He approached Alexander near the end of the evening, his expression considerably less arrogant than it had been during their earlier confrontation. "I confess I may have underestimated Miss Hart's ability to conduct herself appropriately," Frederick admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps this marriage will not prove as damaging to the family's reputation as I initially feared." "I appreciate your reconsideration, Frederick," Alexander said, unable to fully suppress a satisfied smile at his cousin's evident change of heart. As the last guests finally departed and the grand ballroom grew quiet once more, Alexander found Eliza standing alone near the tall windows, gazing out toward the darkened gardens where the newly planted orchard sapling stood, barely visible in the moonlight. "You were magnificent tonight," Alexander said, coming to stand beside her. "I was terrified the entire evening," Eliza admitted, laughing softly with evident relief now that the significant social test had concluded successfully. "I feared every conversation might reveal some fatal misstep, confirming everyone's worst assumptions about my unsuitability for this role." "You need not have worried," Alexander said. "Your natural grace and genuine kindness were evident to everyone present tonight, regardless of whatever prejudices they arrived with. I have never been prouder to call you my future wife." Eliza leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the two of them continued gazing out toward the moonlit orchard, the fragile saplings representing not only the restoration of a childhood memory, but the genuine possibility of a future built upon honesty, resilience, and a promise that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, managed to survive 20 years of separation and hardship. "There is still much to prepare before the wedding," Eliza said softly. "But tonight, for the first time since this entire journey began, I feel genuinely confident that we shall successfully navigate whatever challenges still remain ahead." "As do I," Alexander agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Together, exactly as we always promised each other we would." The weeks that followed passed with considerably less turbulence than the tumultuous months preceding the successful ball, as wedding preparations continued in earnest and society gradually adjusted to the reality of the Duke's unconventional but increasingly respected choice of bride. Margaret threw herself fully into the planning, determined to ensure that her son's wedding day would be remembered not for scandal, but for genuine joy and celebration, a fitting tribute to the remarkable journey that had finally brought Alexander and Eliza back together after so many years apart. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, a rare gift of gentle winter sunshine breaking through weeks of gray clouds and persistent rain, as though the sky itself had chosen to honor the significance of the day with a brief reprieve from the harsh season. Ashcombe Manor had been transformed overnight, garlands of white winter roses draped along every staircase and doorway, while the great hall had been arranged with rows of elegant chairs, facing a simple altar, decorated with sprigs of evergreen and delicate white blossoms grown specially in the estate's greenhouse for the occasion. Eliza woke before dawn, unable to sleep further despite the exhaustion of the previous week's preparations. Grace, who had been given the honor of serving as her closest attendant for the day, found her sitting quietly by the window of her chamber, watching the first light of morning gradually illuminate the frost-covered gardens below. "Are you nervous?" Grace asked gently, settling beside her friend. "Terribly," Eliza admitted, though her voice carried more excitement than genuine anxiety. "I keep thinking back to that day I first arrived at this house, so uncertain and afraid, never imagining that within a matter of months I would be preparing to marry the very man whose family once cast mine aside so cruelly. It feels almost like a dream I fear I might wake from at any moment." "It is no dream," Grace said, taking her friend's hand warmly. "You have earned every bit of this happiness, Eliza, through your own strength and resilience, regardless of everything life has thrown against you these past 20 years. As the appointed hour approached, Eliza's mother arrived to help her into the wedding gown that had been carefully crafted over recent weeks, a simple but elegant dress of ivory silk, adorned with delicate embroidered vines that Margaret herself had suggested, believing the pattern would evoke the very orchard where the couple's original promise had first been made so many years earlier. "Your father would be so incredibly proud, watching you today," Eliza's mother said, her eyes glistening with tears as she carefully adjusted the veil atop her daughter's auburn hair. "He always believed, even during our darkest years of struggle, that something good would eventually come from the suffering we endured. I only wish he could be here to witness this remarkable day himself." "He is here in spirit," Eliza said softly, thinking of the small orchard being carefully restored on the estate grounds, a living tribute to her father's memory and devotion to the land he had tended so faithfully. "I feel his presence with me today more strongly than I have in years." Meanwhile, in a separate chamber across the manor, Alexander prepared for the ceremony with considerably more nervous energy than he typically displayed, much to the amusement of his closest friend, Charles Grant, who had traveled from London specifically to witness the momentous occasion. "I have never seen you quite this anxious," Charles observed, adjusting Alexander's formal cravat with practiced efficiency. "Not even during your presentation before Parliament last year, which I recall left you considerably more composed than you appear at this present moment." "This is rather more significant than any parliamentary presentation," Alexander said, unable to fully suppress his nervous energy. "Today, I finally fulfill a promise I made 20 years ago, one I never truly believed I would have the opportunity to keep, given everything that has transpired between then and now." "Well, you certainly took the scenic route to reach this particular destination," Charles said with a knowing smile. "But I confess, having witnessed the genuine devotion between yourself and Eliza these past weeks, I believe this marriage stands upon a far sturdier foundation than most arranged unions I have observed among our social circle." As the ceremony's appointed hour finally arrived, the assembled guests, including many prominent members of society who had initially greeted news of the engagement with considerable skepticism, settled into their seats within the great hall, the atmosphere charged with anticipation for the unconventional but increasingly celebrated union about to take place. Alexander stood at the altar beside the estate's longtime clergyman, his heart racing with anticipation as the assembled musicians began playing a gentle processional melody. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Eliza appeared, escorted by her mother, given that her father had long since passed and no other male relative remained to fulfill the traditional role. Alexander felt his breath catch as he watched her walk slowly down the aisle, her ivory gown catching the soft winter light streaming through the tall windows, her green eyes locked with his own, carrying an expression of pure, unguarded joy that erased any remaining trace of the fear and caution that had once characterized her every interaction with him. As she reached the altar, her mother placed Eliza's hand gently into Alexander's own, before retreating to her seat amid the assembled guests. The clergyman began the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall as he spoke of the sacred bonds of marriage, the importance of loyalty and devotion, and the remarkable journey that had brought this particular couple to this significant moment. When the time came for the exchange of vows, Alexander found himself momentarily overwhelmed with emotion as he looked into Eliza's eyes, recalling every difficult step of the journey that had led them back to each other after 20 years of painful separation. "Eliza," he began, his voice steady despite the depth of feeling coursing through him, "20 years ago, beneath the apple trees of an orchard now restored in tribute to our shared history, I made you a promise as a foolish, hopeful child who understood nothing of the difficulties life might place between us. I promised that one day I would marry you. Today, I finally keep that promise, not out of childish naivety, but with the full understanding and conviction of a man who has learned, through considerable hardship and reflection, that some bonds are simply too strong to be broken by time, distance, or the harsh judgments of society. I love you completely and without reservation, and I promise to honor, protect, and cherish you for the remainder of our lives together." Eliza, tears streaming freely down her face now, drew a steadying breath before offering her own vows in return. "Alexander, I never allowed myself to believe, during the long years of hardship that followed my family's departure from this estate, that our childhood promise might someday find its way toward fulfillment. I taught myself to survive on practicality rather than hope, fearing that dreams of happiness were a luxury I could no longer afford. But you have shown me, through your unwavering devotion and genuine commitment to righting the wrongs of the past, that hope and love are not merely childish fantasies, but powerful forces capable of overcoming even the most difficult circumstances. I love you, Alexander, and I promise to stand beside you, through whatever challenges the future may yet bring, exactly as I promised you all those years ago beneath the apple trees of our childhood." The clergyman pronounced them husband and wife amid a swell of joyful applause from the assembled guests. And as Alexander leaned forward to seal their union with a gentle kiss, he felt the full weight of the remarkable journey they had traveled together finally settle into a profound and lasting sense of peace. The wedding celebration continued late into the evening, with music, dancing, and genuine joy filling the halls of Ashcombe Manor in a manner the estate had not witnessed in many years. Margaret, watching her son dance with his new bride, found herself unexpectedly moved to tears, a rare display of emotion for a woman who had spent decades cultivating an image of stoic composure. "I confess, I never imagined I would witness such genuine happiness at one of my own children's weddings," Margaret admitted to Charles Grant, who stood nearby observing the joyful celebration. "Most aristocratic unions are built upon practical convenience rather than authentic affection. Watching Alexander and Eliza together, I find myself reconsidering many assumptions I have long held regarding the true purpose of marriage." As the celebration continued, Alexander eventually led Eliza away from the crowded ballroom, guiding her toward the newly planted orchard that now stood at the eastern edge of the estate grounds, illuminated softly by strings of lanterns hung carefully among the young apple trees for the occasion. "I wanted us to share one quiet moment here together, before the evening's festivities fully consume our attention," Alexander said, as the two of them walked slowly among the young saplings, their branches bare in the winter chill but full of promise for the seasons yet to come. "It is perfect," Eliza said softly, gazing up at the star-filled sky visible through the orchard's still developing canopy. "A fitting place to begin our life together, given everything this orchard represents for both of us." "I have been thinking," Alexander said, "that perhaps in the years to come we might use this orchard not only as a tribute to our own history, but as a lesson for future generations, a reminder that promises made with genuine sincerity, regardless of how impossible they may initially seem, are always worth honoring, whatever obstacles time and circumstance might place in their path." Eliza smiled, leaning into his embrace as the distant sounds of music and celebration continued drifting from the manor behind them. "I believe that would be a beautiful legacy indeed, Alexander. One I am honored to help you build, for as long as we both shall live." As the newly married couple stood together beneath the young orchard trees, the promise made so many years earlier by two innocent children fully and completely fulfilled, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him, not only for the remarkable woman now standing beside him as his wife, but for the painful journey that had ultimately led them both toward this moment of genuine, hard-won happiness. The years that followed brought their own share of challenges, as any genuine partnership inevitably does, but Alexander and Eliza faced each obstacle with the same unwavering commitment and mutual devotion that had carried them through the difficult months of their initial reunion. Margaret, gradually shedding the rigid formality that had once defined her relationship with her son, grew to genuinely cherish Eliza as her own daughter, often remarking to close friends that her daughter-in-law possessed a wisdom and grace that far exceeded what mere noble birth could ever provide. The orchard flourished alongside their marriage, the young saplings growing steadily stronger with each passing season, until within a few short years, the trees bore fruit once again upon the very grounds where a young duke and a gardener's daughter had first exchanged their innocent, hopeful promise. And every autumn, when the apples finally ripened upon those branches, Alexander and Eliza would walk together among the trees, recalling with quiet gratitude the remarkable journey that had brought them from painful separation through considerable hardship, finally arriving at a lasting happiness that neither of them had ever truly stopped believing, in the deepest corners of their hearts, they might someday find together. 5 years passed since the wedding day beneath the winter sunshine, and Ashcombe Manor had transformed into a household filled with laughter and warmth that few, who remembered its more formal, restrained atmosphere from decades earlier, would easily recognize. The orchard Alexander and Eliza had planted together now stood tall and full, its branches heavy each autumn with ripe, fragrant apples that the estate's children, both noble and common alike, delighted in gathering during the harvest season. Eliza had given birth to 2 children in the years following their marriage, a daughter named Rose, who had inherited her mother's striking green eyes and gentle warmth, and a son named William, who possessed his father's thoughtful curiosity and his grandfather's quiet devotion to justice and fairness. Margaret, now a doting grandmother, had softened considerably from the rigid, formal woman she had once been, spending countless afternoons in the orchard with her grandchildren, teaching them the names of the various apple varieties and sharing stories of the remarkable journey that had brought their parents together. The reforms Alexander had implemented across the estate continued to flourish as well, extending far beyond the original commitments he had made in his public statement years earlier. Fair wages, proper medical care for injured workers, and pension arrangements for aging staff members had become standard practice not only at Ashcombe Manor, but at numerous other estates throughout the region, as neighboring landowners gradually recognized the practical and moral benefits of treating their workers with genuine dignity and respect. Walter, the old groundskeeper who had shared his memories of Edmund Hart with Alexander so many years earlier, lived long enough to witness the full flourishing of the restored orchard, often remarking with quiet satisfaction that Edmund would have been immensely proud to see his beloved daughter presiding over the very grounds he had once tended with such devoted care. Grace, who had remained close friends with Eliza throughout the years, eventually married Simon, the stable hand who had once scrambled to saddle Alexander's horse during that desperate ride to the village station, and the two of them continued serving the estate faithfully, their own children growing up alongside Rose and William in the warm, welcoming atmosphere that now defined life at Ashcombe Manor. Lady Cordelia Ashford, whose initial resentment had gradually transformed into genuine friendship following the memorable ball years earlier, eventually married a respected gentleman from a neighboring county, a union built on genuine affection rather than practical convenience, one she often credited to witnessing firsthand the remarkable courage Eliza had displayed in pursuing authentic happiness despite considerable social pressure to conform to convention. Frederick, Alexander's once hostile cousin, remained a distant and somewhat prickly relation, though even he could not deny, as the years passed, the evident success and happiness that had resulted from Alexander's unconventional choice, occasionally sending stiff but genuine notes of congratulations whenever significant family milestones occurred, a small but meaningful sign of his gradual, reluctant acceptance. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted gently across the estate grounds, Alexander found Eliza sitting beneath the largest of the orchard's apple trees, watching their 2 children chase each other playfully through the fallen leaves, while Margaret looked on with evident delight from a nearby bench. "Do you remember," Eliza said, as Alexander settled beside her on the soft grass, "how frightened I was that very first day when you recognized the ring on my finger?" "I remember it vividly," Alexander said, smiling at the memory despite how much anguish that particular moment had caused them both at the time. "I remember thinking my heart might stop entirely, seeing that small iron ring after so many years of believing our childhood promise had been nothing more than a foolish fantasy." "It was never foolish," Eliza said softly, watching Rose and William laugh together as they gathered fallen apples into a small woven basket. "It was simply a promise that required considerable patience, courage, and perhaps a measure of good fortune before it could finally be fulfilled. I often think about how differently our lives might have unfolded had you not been assigned to serve tea that particular afternoon," Alexander mused. "How easily we might have continued living entirely separate lives, never knowing that the promise we made as children still held such profound significance for us both." "But we did meet again," Eliza said, taking his hand gently in her own. "Despite every obstacle, every painful year of separation and hardship, we found our way back to each other, exactly as you always believed we would." Alexander lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against the gold ring he had placed there years earlier, the very ring that still rested beside the original crude iron band she continued to wear, a permanent reminder of both the humble beginning and joyful fulfillment of their shared promise. "I made you a promise beneath these very trees, all those years ago," Alexander said. "And though it took 20 years, considerable heartache, and no small measure of stubborn determination from us both, I am endlessly grateful that we finally found the courage to see that promise through to its rightful conclusion." As the golden autumn light filtered gently through the orchard's branches, and their children's joyful laughter echoed across the peaceful grounds, Alexander and Eliza sat together in comfortable, contented silence, fully aware of how remarkably fortunate they had been to rediscover, after so many painful years apart, a love that had somehow managed to survive every hardship life had placed in its path. The story of the Duke and the housemaid's daughter eventually became something of a local legend throughout the region, told and retold among the villages surrounding Ashcombe Manor, as a testament to the enduring power of genuine love and unwavering promises, regardless of the social barriers or painful circumstances that might initially seem to stand in their way. Parents would often share the tale with their own children, particularly during difficult times, as a gentle reminder that hope, patience, and genuine courage could ultimately overcome even the most seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And every autumn, when the apples ripened once again upon the branches of the orchard that Alexander and Eliza had lovingly restored together, the entire estate would gather for a joyful harvest celebration, a tradition that continued for many years afterward, honoring not only the bountiful fruit of the season, but the remarkable journey of two childhood friends who had refused to let time, distance, or the harsh judgments of society extinguish the promise they had made to each other so many years earlier, beneath the very same trees that now stood as a living testament to their enduring, hard-won happiness. Years later, when Rose and William had grown old enough to understand the full significance of their parents' remarkable story, Eliza would often bring them to sit beneath the largest apple tree in the orchard, sharing with them the tale of a small iron ring, a shattered teacup, and a promise made between two innocent children who never stopped believing, even during the darkest years of hardship and separation, that genuine love was always worth fighting for, regardless of whatever obstacles life might place in its path. "Someday," Eliza would tell her children, watching their wide, curious eyes as they listened intently to the story of their parents' unlikely reunion, "you will understand that the most meaningful promises in life are rarely the easiest ones to keep. But they are always, without exception, the ones most deeply worth honoring, no matter how long the journey toward their fulfillment might ultimately require." And as the seasons continued their gentle, steady progression, the orchard at Ashcombe Manor flourished ever more abundantly with each passing year, its roots growing deeper into the very soil where a childhood promise had first been made, its branches reaching ever higher toward the sky, a living, breathing testament to the enduring truth that some bonds, forged in the innocent sincerity of childhood friendship, prove far stronger and more resilient than even the most formidable barriers society might attempt to place between two hearts destined to find their way back to each other, regardless of how long or difficult that journey might ultimately prove to be.